Let's get into it.
Let's get into it.
I want to get back to the Yoga Vasistha. And
you look super excited.
I love the Yoga Vasistha, dude. You know what? It is a vexing text because it's just, and we'll talk about this a little bit, but it's so repetitive, right? And we've talked about this a little bit before, and I want to talk about it, and because it is relevant to what I want to talk about today. Today we're going to talk about the story of King Janaka. Right? King Janaka, as you know, if you know, you know, he's actually the future father-in-law of Lord Rama, right? He's the king of Videha, the father of Videhi, also known as Sita Ma. And we're given an anecdote of Lord Janaka, King Janaka, roving in the pleasure gardens, which I don't know what pleasure gardens actually are. I don't even want to get into it, but he's roving in the pleasure gardens and he overhears a bunch of like rishis or pandits or whatever, and they're all like singing. They're actually doing like an a cappella where they're just singing about the joys of not craving anything. And they're just like, we are in light, in light, in light. And like they're singing it in a chorus. And he's like, damn, this song is kind of bumming me out because I'm this guy who's so attached to all these worldly pursuits. I'm a king, this and that. And he kind of comes to the realization, and there was one really important moment in his contemplation where he goes, even heaven is nothing. Even heaven sucks. And to me, this is a very important evolution in kind of dharmic thought in general, where they abandon the concept of heaven. Right? Heaven, at the end of the day, is boring. As a concept, it does not liberate at all. In fact, it's just another sort of a binding, right? And it's a very important point why heaven is not something that Hindus really ascribe to as a value, right? No matter what you do, you hear things about Patalok and Indralok and things like that. Devaloka and all that stuff, right?
We don't pursue making it up there. That's the area of the gods.
That's the area of the gods. Now, there are certain things where you'll read where it's like, oh, if you have done especially well in this life, you can spend some time in Indraloka, right? Or in Patalok if you fucked up. You know what I mean? But all these things really, if you believe in them at all, are really just states of a sort of what the Christians might call purgatory. You know what I mean? Like heaven is not the ultimate destination, and it makes perfect sense why. Because all the descriptions of heaven and Janaka himself stumbles upon this realization is that it's essentially going to be boring there. It's not going to be immune from the pitfalls of all these things that are binding us, right? It's filled with pleasure. That's what it is. Heaven is essentially a carrot that is dangled in front of people. And I'm speaking now historically. Heaven is a carrot that is dangled in front of people who are attached to worldly pleasures as a way to get them to behave in society. That's all it is. So if you're good now, you're going to get a bunch of pleasure later. Okay. If you keep it in line now, if you don't pillage and indulge in your most, base compulsions, you are going to go to heaven, guys. And there you can indulge all of them for eternity. That is essentially what heaven means to all the other faiths that believe in heaven, right? And that's what it is. And what you see there is a sort of boredom. Right. And you understand why heaven can never really be very satisfying. Pleasure, as we know it, is not actually pleasant. This is the one thing I really wanted to talk about today. Pleasure is not pleasant because it is always attended by its shadow, which is pain. And any good Advaitin will tell you that the wise see pleasure and pain as actually the same thing. They're the same thing. They're on the same continuum. And I was thinking about this a lot. And I was thinking about this specifically. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, even though my birthday is upon me. But let's just say that I have ruined entire weekends from eating a whole mission burrito in one sitting. Okay, I have. I've tormented my body by doing these things, and you really see what this says in the Gita as well, right? What the wise see as pleasure at first, as nectar quickly turns to poison, right?
I thought you meant Krishna was like, don't fuck with mission burritos.
I mean, basically, or missionary burritos.
There you go.
But it's true. Like, you will suffer from doing some of these things. And it's like, I was thinking about it, and this is a bit crass, but like, yes, at first it's tasty food. Oh my gosh, it's wonderful going in. But all it is in the end is a very painful shit. Okay, that's what all of this is. That's what all of this is, guys. You know what I mean? The more sattvic your lifestyle can be in terms of your dietary habits, the better off you're going to be. You're going to be closer to that more lasting bliss. And this tends to everything that we do for pleasure. A night of drinking, it might seem like fun at first, but the next day, it's just a hangover waiting to happen. It's just misery. And again, when you're hungover, you're then also more prone to other kinds of pleasures, you know what I mean, that are there to kind of act as a salve or a balm over the hangover, right?
The mission burrito.
The mission burrito is what you'll get, right? You'll get a mission burrito, and then your stomach's all messed up, and you're just like, I can't deal with this, you know? And I'm not saying to avoid pleasure entirely, but again, we have to have a very measured approach to what is pleasurable, you know? Heaven is bullshit. There is no such thing as heaven. It's only hell in another form, actually. And the real liberation is to go beyond these concepts of heaven and hell and to unbind ourselves, right? And we even see this in the struggles of the gods, right? Of the devas, right? These are the people who are enjoying all the great sensual pleasures that they can, but they're always getting themselves into trouble and into into mischief of various sorts. And they'll insult a rishi or somebody who's a truly based, switched on personality, right? And they'll insult them in some way because of their arrogance, because of their intense ego sense, their ahamkara, which is too overly developed. And then they end up, having to suffer because of that, right? And then they're always getting into wars. They're always grasping onto things. And then, we got our asses kicked by the asuras. Oh, please, Lord Brahma, help us. I can't help you. Shiva, help us. Oh, you got to ask Vishnu. Go ask Dad. It's kind of that vibe, right? And then you have to be dragged out of the hell of your own creation, essentially. So Hinduism and Dharma in general is a metaphysical system that goes beyond heaven and hell. We don't believe in those things. Heaven and hell are things that exist actually in this plane of reality, because it's all about desires, pains and desires. That's all it's about. And our goal is to decondition ourselves, to get away from these desires in a way, or to have a healthy understanding or reckoning of what these desires are, but never letting them own you, ever, ever, ever. Okay, the Yoga Vasistha, guys, is a very repetitive book. Okay, it is a very repetitive book. And I realize that this is by design, really, right? This is because one of the things that we're learning in the story of Janaka is that what Lord Vasistha tells Rama is that there are two ways of achieving this sort of liberation, right? One is through direct knowledge or experience, and we see that in the story of Leela, where she does the meditation on Saraswati or whoever, and who comes and says, okay, well, listen, here's what this is all about, shows her the multiverse, shows her what the reality is actually all about, and why there's no point in trying to clutch onto the life or clutch onto your husband or the pleasures that come with that, right? That's one experience. It is a moment that you are given that knowledge very directly. And then the other comes through contemplation, and that's what we see from King Janaka, right? He is contemplating these things, and then he comes to the realization of abandoning the subject-object relation, to abandon the experience, right? The act of being the experiencer, to exist as that which is experiencing, right? That's a very important, that's how that whole subject-object binary collapses, right? You are not the doer of the thing, you are not the object of the doing of the thing, you are the act, actually, of that itself. And there's two forms of that, and so knowledge given to you directly, that's direct experience, that's the thing we're all after, and then there's contemplation, and that's what we're doing here. That's what Janaka is doing, and that is what we were doing in the Yoga Vasistha, and this is why the Yoga Vasistha is such a repetitive text. This is why I've realized this, right? We talked about this on early episodes. Oh, it comes in different pastas and the different texts of Advaita and so on, telling us the same thing over and over again. We all love different kinds of pastas, but it's still all just pasta, right? Similarly, reading the Yoga Vasistha I've realized it's a sort of textual japmala that you're constantly going through, and you're getting the same concepts over and over and over again, right? And it's a constant repetition of those concepts of aham brahasmi, I am Brahman, tattavamasi, I am that, whatever the other two mahavakyas are, the great sayings are about Advaita. That's what it is that you're getting. It's the constant repetition of that. And through that repetition, that's how the lessons are actually being driven home. It seems tedious at first, but it's through the repetitions of these lessons, right? Constant instruction of the sages, right? Constant reading of the scriptures. That is the value of it. There's no thing by doing it of like, by doing this, I'm going to go to heaven. It's by constantly repeating these things to yourself that you're going to unbind yourself from desire, from cravings, which is what we call volitional desire. That's another concept that we've been reading about in the Yoga Vasistha. right? It frees you from volitional desire and the samsara that it brings with it of repetitive histories. And so to me, I found that kind of interesting to think about, that the whole reason, because I get frustrated sometimes with the Yoga Vasistha. It's discursively very repetitive, highly recursive text of just saying the same thing over and over and over again, which is that you are pure consciousness. That is what you are. You are pure consciousness, and you must liberate the mind to seek the mind beyond the mind, achieve that state of nirvikalpa, which leads us to moksha. And the constant repetition of it is helpful. It is. Whether we realize it or not, as tedious as it might be or not, remember, when you're doing japmala, what are you doing? You're actually communing with the object of that japas, right? Of that repetition. That is what it's about. And the same thing is happening when you're constantly reading about this concept of letting go, freeing yourself of the desires, of the cravings, communing with the true source, with Brahman, right? And I don't know, I thought, excuse me, to me, it makes sense that we're having to learn these lessons over and over and over again. Because in every story you read in the Yoga Vasistha, you're like, okay, well, it's a new story. Maybe there's going to be some new moral to it. Nope, it's the same moral every time. Now, it is worth reading because along the way, you learn different concepts of different Hindu concepts, right? Different ways of framing desire, different ways of liberating yourself, things like that. So it is very important to read them every time. But the end lesson, the end goal is always the same throughout all of these, which is recognizing yourself as Brahman, as super consciousness.
Wow.
I was doing a lot of coughing there because I was breathlessly going through all of this.
Breathless, bro. You're like Shankar Mahadevan. I think about Dharmic and then Abrahamic religions often in a conversation of permanence versus impermanence. And I think that Dharmic thought actually gives a lot of credence to ideas of impermanence.
Yeah.
And obviously we have ideas of permanence. I think there's a good argument to say that moksha or liberation is a state of permanence, maybe. But ideas like heaven or hell are absolutely ideas of permanence, right? And they have a lot to do with the soul kind of permeating forever in whichever area that it ends up, whether it's above or below. And I think something really interesting is the idea of repetition in that. If Dharma often makes such a great argument for impermanence, that kind of gives a lot of credence to the idea of repetition. Because repetition is something that keeps going. You're doing it over and over again, right? Whether that's reincarnation or just a mantra with your japmala, right?
Right. Well, it's about freeing yourself from that repetition, right? Because again, we define samsara as repetitive histories within the Yoga Vasistha. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, I don't know. Is that tracking with what you're saying?
Kind of. I just think that, like, me personally and my skeptic mind, I don't know how I feel about freeing myself from anything, really. Yeah. Like, I see myself as, like, just constantly moving through something, which is why ideas like reincarnation, which is, again, like a japmala. Yeah. Right? And these cyclical kind of ways of thinking, like, it's less permanent in the way of, like, heaven or hell and more repetitive, if you will, in the idea within the context of impermanence.
Well, I mean, the thing is that it's the repetition has a purpose, right? Or it should be purposeful in that, like, it's a constant refining, right, of a thing before it can be liberated from that amplitude of births, right? True. Births and rebirths. But it's an interesting concept. But I think you're right in terms of the Abrahamic religions and their desire for permanence, right? But the concept of heaven to me does not satisfy that permanence.
Well, you know, these ideas of permanence exist in India too, right? Like, Dvaita, very bhakti-driven thought in that kind of sense is like it's kind of aspiring for permanence, right? Because there's like a separation between Bhagavan and the soul. Whereas in Advaita, by kind of making a case for the fact that Brahman and Atman are one, I think Advaita thought makes an argument for the fact that what I am right now is more impermanent. If that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. But to me, in the Veda thought, like Bhakti traditions as well, is that striving for the permanent, right? And I think to me, you can conceptualize these things in terms of the real and the unreal, right? And we define what is unreal as that which is constantly subject to change, right? And that's why our goal is to penetrate to that to get to that ultimate source. Now, a bhakti person will say that that's the Godhead of Krishna per se, right? But really, that's not too different because that's a union with the original source. You know what I mean? That's what that is. Even a bhakti person doesn't think that they're going to reach some kind of a heaven that's there where they're enjoying things that are kind of materially binding, right?
I'd say that's where I'd say there's a lot of diversity in terms of how people pray in India, right? Like there is a lot of like I know people who would probably ascribe more to that kind of an idea of bhakti.
Well,
versus bhakti even in the context. Like, I think a lot of people live in a more Dvaitic fashion than they do Advaitic.
I think so too, but that's in how one practices it, right? And I think, I think one of the great things is that there is also a way of thinking where it's like you have to get beyond even thinking about this in terms of dualism and non-dualism, because bhakti is actually the way of is a way of actually achieving that ecstatic place, right? Of actual permanence, right? Of getting over that hump. You dissolve yourself. You're dissolving the I amness, the ego, the ahamkara in the object of your affections, which is the deity, right? And so to me, it's actually kind of doing the same thing in many ways.